Hello everyone and welcome to the GL Employment Team's video Q&A session on remote working and the return to the office.
Hi everyone and welcome from me. So on Monday the 5th of July, as most of you will be aware, the Prime Minister announced the proposal to continue with the easing of the coronavirus restrictions, hopefully on the 19th of July. Now, whilst a final decision is yet to be made, which is due next Monday, the 12th of July, this advance warning gives businesses the opportunity to start preparing for what work might look like in the not too distant future. Now, the working from home legislation and subsequent guidance has been in place for much of the last 16 months, but this is one of the most significant proposals for relaxation of these measures. And Boris Johnson confirmed that, and I quote, "It will no longer be necessary for government to instruct people to work from home, so employers will be able to start planning a safe return to the workplace." So what does this mean for business owners and HR managers? What do you need to be telling staff and putting in place from the 19th of July onwards, if that is confirmed for that date? We're going to consider some of these further issues in these FAQs today. So, Nick, question number one, where do we even start?
Good question. Well, I suppose for many businesses, they're unclear what they would like to implement in the longer term. But it's important now, before any announcements are made to staff, that business must first decide what it wants, how it wants to go ahead with any form of hybrid or remote working. It might be the case that businesses have surveyed their staff, so they may already have an idea of staff preferences. But as a primary issue, I think you need to consider really what works for your business. For example, decide what you mean by a hybrid agile working. For example, does it just relate to an employee's place of work? Or perhaps also are you thinking about changing hours of work or giving some flexibility around hours? Will it be imposed on staff or do they need to apply for hybrid working? Think also about what your customers and clients need and expect. Will your service delivery be different if you're adopting a hybrid or remote working model? It's important that you keep the focus on the business and your customers as central to any decision making. So if you're unsure where to start, I think you need to consider what works for your business and of course for your customers and clients. So question two then, over to you, Cecily. Can we just wait and see and not say anything?
Not really. We really wouldn't recommend this, especially if you want a smooth transition and engaged workforce during what are going to be further and changeable times. Now, as we anticipate, and the Prime Minister has announced, the working from home guidance will end at some point, be that the 19th of July or another date. And if you just don't say anything, then you run a risk that there'll be a real lack of direction and potentially focus as well. Some staff may return to the workplace, or others may assume that they can continue working remotely. You're going to have a period of uncertainty and staff not knowing what to do. So we strongly recommend that the business actually leads the way and communicate what it expects of staff in advance of any change taking effect. So I suppose onto the slightly bigger issues then, Nick. Question number three, what are the options?
Yeah, that is a big question. First of all, you need to consider how you want to approach this. Do you want to take an all staff perspective or are you going to be specific to certain teams and roles? With an all-staff approach, i.e. you must all return to the office, if it's going to be that, then it needs to be consistent, but it may not be suitable for all businesses depending on the range of roles that may be in place and certain roles or duties and the needs of those roles and duties. For example, in manufacturing, obviously it'll be much more difficult to have a whole business approach when the factory floor staff are clearly required to be on site and working, as they will likely have been throughout the whole of the pandemic, in comparison possibly to administrative or office-based staff, finance, accounts, etc., who may have been working remotely throughout. So if, however, your workforce is largely similar, i.e. mostly office-based, then a one-size-fits-all approach may be easier for you to implement. Generally speaking, though, there are three broad options. Number one, everyone returns to their contractual place of work. In other words, going back to how it was pre-pandemic, no change to their contractual place of work. The second option is that you're implementing a business-imposed remote working or a mix. So you're implementing a hybrid or a mixed way of working, which continues to permit remote working in some form. However, that also allows for staff to return to the workplace more regularly. This can either be on a temporary basis, whilst restrictions continue to ease and the vaccinations are rolled out, or on a more permanent basis. Finally, option 3, some businesses may have closed their offices and their workplaces completely during the pandemic. So staff have moved to permanent home or remote working, that type of arrangement. If so, then this will amount to a change to their contractual place of work. So once you've considered those 3 options, I suppose the next question is, can we do a test run or a trial period for a new hybrid remote working environment?
Thanks, Nick. That's been really helpful to summarise those options. And yes, absolutely, particularly if you're considering one of the newer sort of hybrid or agile mix of remote working arrangements, we would really recommend having a trial run or a test period. We'd even go so far as saying that initially any change is actually on a trial basis, and that gives the business the flexibility and the opportunity to see how it works, to see if there are any issues that you need to harness or build upon, and particularly lessons learned in the pandemic. We've all been familiar in the last 16 months that change is really the only constant. So having something subject to a trial period enables you to build in flexibility to develop as you go through that initial process. So some of the more practical, sort of interesting questions we've been asked when businesses are considering this. One example is hot desking. So Nick, would implementing hot desking be a contractual change to someone's terms and conditions?
Yeah, okay. Hot desking is quite a hot topic, I think, at the moment. I think implementing hot desking is unlikely to be a contractual change, but that actually depends on the wording in your employment contracts. If hot desking was widely in place before the pandemic as a matter of practice and you're simply returning to this, then this is less likely to be an issue for you. But if, however, you're implementing hot desking because of a reduced workplace or work around social distancing, meaning there's less seating, then practically this is more likely to be a more significant change to the way that staff work. But I think arguably it's still unlikely to be a contractual change, as it would be very unusual to have a specific desk or seat allocated to someone in a contract. But it is a practical change to how they work nonetheless. So in order to effect smooth and least disruptive change, talk about it to staff. Explain why you're implementing hot desking and when it comes into effect, how it'll work and what safety requirements are, etc. Another interesting question we've got is, do we have to define what is a reasonable commuting distance from work or from the office, or reasonable notice to attend the office if managers are requiring people to come in?
That's a really good question. So if you elect to continue home working in some form, then businesses should really be looking to implement policies that support that change or that method of working. And typically those types of policies will include a requirement for staff to work what we call within a reasonable commuting distance. Or it may be that they're required to attend the workplace on reasonable notice from their line manager. Now, you don't, strictly speaking, have to define those terms, but you will absolutely face questions on these, so do be prepared in advance. Be consistent, whichever approach you do decide to take, either defining them or not. And if you don't define the terms, then this does provide the business with flexibility. You can then deal with queries on a case-by-case basis, depending on the individual, the role, and the query they've asked and the circumstances surrounding that. If, however, you do decide to define the terms, then set it out, of course, in the policy and communicate that clearly to ensure that it's fair and you've got a consistent approach between teams and departments. So you could, for example, set a time-based distance. So you could say that a reasonable commuting distance is 90 minutes from the office. Or you could, for example, say that reasonable notice from a line manager to request your attendance at the workplace is 24 hours. Those would be good examples, and you could absolutely use those if you decided to do so, but communicate those within a policy and to the line managers as well. But do be mindful. So a few things that arise with that. Obviously, if you set 90 minutes, what happens if somebody's 93 minutes and outside of that? But also be mindful of the distances that staff may have been commuting previously. And it's not something that businesses will have been, strictly speaking, considering all the way through. Particularly for London-based offices, it may be that staff were commuting for several hours beforehand. And if you then set a reasonable commuting distance that is shorter than what they were previously doing, you are likely to face questions. So it is something you want to carefully review and consider before making a decision whether you define those terms or deal with it on a case-by-case basis. So looking at question number 7, what does a typical consultation involve?
Well, I suppose consultation involves communicating effectively with staff to ensure that they're updated on workplace matters. You should actively seek and consider their views before making a decision. Technically speaking, I suppose, consultation is required where there is to be a change to their existing terms and conditions. If you're changing their place of work to their home or a hybrid mix, for example, in this instance, then you'll need to consult and certainly obtain each member of staff's agreement to the contractual change. And we would always recommend getting this confirmed in writing too. If the method that you're proposing doesn't constitute a change to contractual terms and conditions, then consultation may not be strictly required, but practically, and certainly from an employee relations perspective, it will be important to communicate any developments clearly and in advance. I suppose the typical stages of consultation would involve, number one, prepare internally at a senior level and discuss with senior team leaders. You need understanding and buy-in from the senior management team. Then you would proceed with making an announcement to staff about the consultation and what you're going to be consulting about. Then have a discussion with the staff or works council if you have one. Approach that works council and have a meeting and discussion with them about the changes that you're thinking about implementing. Then share the policies for review and discussion. Let everyone see and make comment upon them. Try and facilitate discussion at all levels, including at one-to-one, team level. Have a series of FAQs prepared, possibly allow for drop-in sessions. The idea is that you should be answering questions that come up in the consultation process and also listening and responding to any ideas that come. It might be that useful ideas come out that could change your thinking about the plans you're proposing to take. All of this really needs to be done before the new system is implemented. So if you are going to consultation, what documents do you need, Cecily?
Good question. So certainly, as you outlined in the previous question, Nick, you really need to be planning ahead. So having a project or timeline plan that facilitates you to be able to properly consider those early practical but also legal issues that you'll need to work through is going to be really invaluable. Now, obviously, that document is going to be a slightly movable feast, and it will need to be updated and regularly reviewed as you go through. But if you go into it blindly without having put in place a bit of an outline of a plan, you are going to get taken off track slightly. So that is a really helpful resource. Secondly, we certainly recommend having a policy. Now, it's not that we're biased and lawyers always recommend having paperwork in place, but policies can be really, really helpful, particularly in a change like this instance. So if you're going, for example, to a hybrid, agile or remote way of working, have one of those policies. Set out what it means. Is it an interim measure or is it permanent? How is that going to affect with things like health and safety assessments? What equipment you're going to provide? Now, it might be that you've answered a lot of those questions or had some of these issues considered throughout the pandemic so far, but it'd be important to put those in place in a policy that we would strongly recommend is non-contractual and is a bit of a working review document as you go through the next few months. Number three, we'd also recommend having a letter to staff, which introduces that policy, gets them to, explains the business's rationale and why it's implementing this change and what it will mean for staff. It's a really helpful way of sending that out and attaching the policy for them to review. And then finally, training materials for managers and staff. Now, that may be an FAQ policy document like you talked about before, Nick, in the previous question, but it could be that you have more of a structured session and PowerPoint slides or materials for managers, so they have the buy-in and understanding from the business at the outset, but also then for staff. And it might be that one member of the business asks an absolutely brilliant question, like the hot desking question we had previously, and you want to then share that answer to the rest of the workforce as you go through. And that could come into place with an FAQ or in a drop-in session document and following up. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all document list that you'd need. It does ultimately depend on the process that you're looking at, but those four overview types of documents are really going to be the ones you're going to be looking at. And then finally, Nick, a bit of a thorny question, but what if staff refuse? What can you do then?
That's quite an unusual one, really, but there will be circumstances where some staff, I suppose, refuse to accept the change that you're proposing to make, be that asking them to work from a hybrid remote way or work entirely remotely. There will be some, I suppose, that refuse and just want to go back to the old ways of working. If they are refusing and you're making your change because, for example, you've now got less office space or building availability and you simply need to implement the change, then you're probably going to have to implement a change to terms and conditions of employment. And I expect that you're probably going to be implementing quite a wholesale change because most businesses will have more than 20 staff. So there's a possibility that you may need to enter into a formal collective consultation process if you're proposing to ultimately terminate and re-engage staff on new contracts. Because if staff don't agree to a change to their terms and conditions, the only way you're really going to be able to implement the change is to terminate the existing contract and re-engage with a new place of work or a new manner of working, hybrid or remote. And you're going to have to give staff the choice of either accepting that new change or walking away. And so if you're going to be doing that, and there's a potential that 20 or more might be refusing, then you certainly need to be going through a formal collective consultation process, which could be a 30-day or a 45-day formal consultation process with either union representatives or elected employee representatives. So that's quite a detailed process that needs to be gone through, and something that you may have to think about if you really feel there's a pushback from a certain cohort of your staff about the changes that you're proposing to make. I think if you do get to that position, you should certainly be seeking further advice around those processes to be adopted. So overall, I think that's a really interesting set of questions on the things that an employer needs to think about if they're thinking about changing their places of work and introducing a hybrid or remote working process and policy post 19th of July. It's certainly a good resume, really, of what employers need to think about now, and certainly should be looking at and thinking about. I think the only thing I can say now is it's an interesting world ahead of us. The 19th of July is not that far away, and I think some businesses will jump straight in, others will take their time. One thing I think we are seeing more and more is, in terms of recruitment, an awful lot of staff are looking for places and businesses and jobs and roles that have this type of working arrangement available to them. They've seen the light as part of the pandemic, and they look for a work-life balance now that works for them. So for some businesses, obviously, whilst clients and customers need to be central, the ability to recruit and retain good quality staff is also important, and staff will look for these type of arrangements to be in place. Over to you, Cecily. Anything final you'd like to say?
I mean, it may be an obvious point, we've addressed it as we go through, but you can't prepare enough. It really is worth sitting it down, brainstorming it with your senior team or just yourself, and sharing ideas as to what it is you want, and then lead the changes you go through. By all means, get staff buy-in, but we often see that actually if you start too quickly or you've not thought about it properly, it can become unhinged later on in the process. So preparation is definitely key. If you start thinking about it now, it's not too late, and you've got plenty of time to put in place a system that works for you, your clients, and your workforce.
Yeah, I agree very much. I think I need to do a shout out to your flowchart, which should be available on our website. And if anyone wants further information, do go to our website, and we will be able to, there'll be other information on there about introducing hybrid agile working. And of course, Cecily and I will be able to assist you if you've got any questions. Do give us a call or send us an email. We'll be happy to talk through some issues with you if you've got questions, or you'll just want to consider a particular issue. Please do get in touch with us. We always love speaking to our clients.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.